the reality of my experience fit the expectations of what I thought it would be. One of the most, if not the most single impressive piece of tech I've ever used, but also I find myself struggling to sort of come up with an idea of like what I will use this thing for long term that I can't already do that's good enough on, like, let's say, a laptop or an iPhone that's worth justifying the $3,500 cost. The productivity side of it is more impressive and useful than I thought it would be, but I don't find myself wanting to do breaking news through a VR headset right now. But I will say it's like it's really immersive. Like the immersive videos are. It feels like you're actually in the room with Alicia Keys singing next to you. It's that crazy. The audio quality is really good. I mean, you have two displays the size of a postage stamp, which with 23 million pixels on a micro OLED display, which is like extremely difficult technology to put into something so small. Apple's been working on this for 7 years. So, it's a really impressive thing. I just don't I think I'll end up returning it just because I don't find myself foreseeing using it in my daily life, which I feel like for that price, I kind of want that. But I also feel like it's, with the second or third gen, Apple's going to hit a sweet spot in terms of, I think, price and weight. And the app's ecosystem will be way more built out, which I don't there's only 600 apps compatible and were built custom for this Vision Pro, which to some people might sound like a lot, but it's not when you consider how many apps are on the iPhone App Store, the iPad App Store. Spotify, Netflix, they don't support this thing yet. YouTube doesn't either. Just don't think it's worth the $3,500 right now.
Like most forms of technology, at first there's a lot of resistance and eventually acceptance. And I think this will eventually go that way. I think there's going to be a lot of use cases, especially inside the home. I've already seen these demos with someone watching 5 NBA games at the same time. Um, there's all sorts of stuff that I think would be really cool. However, I will say, as an old person, seeing these videos of people walking outside doing gestures while wearing these goggles is infuriating. I find these to be the biggest douchebags I've ever seen in my entire life. And if I see one of these people on a hiking trail trying to like play Pokemon Go with their goggles, they're not going to come out of the woods alive.
Having used the Vision Pro, there are certain things that I've seen in those videos that you can't actually do in the Vision Pro. Like, you can't type with multiple fingers at once. You can only point and touch one key at a time. So that dude that was like on the train typing with all of his fingers, he's just completely trolling people.
I agree with a lot of Sawyer's points. It's silly, it's useless, it's sometimes painful, sometimes nauseating, but also just incredible. And there's a lot of things that they really got right, and a lot of things that are still incredibly half baked. For example, typing with one finger. I mean, you should see me like trying to type anything. It's like such an exercise in frustration. You just feel so stupid because you're like, I could take my phone out and type this in 1 second, but instead I'm like trying to type it. The amount of like false inputs and false taps and stuff like that is kind of insane. But there really is something here. Not in this product iteration, but I think in future iterations. So, the idea is essentially you have like this 3D space around you and you can sort of orient these apps around you. And then instead of having to, switch apps on your phone, you can essentially just sort of turn your head, look at the app. You can make it sort of bigger than any TV you have. It's, when I think about like the future paradigm of computing, it probably looks more in that direction where just have a pair of glasses or something like that I put on and I can see these interfaces overlaid over my world. And the input method with computer vision where I can just sort of wave my hand and control these apps is really cool. I could see us moving into a world where that becomes more of a primary computing interface compared to the phones that we use today.
Did you guys own Quest 2 before?
I do, yeah. But I always, it was always you try it, it goes in a drawer after a week and you'd never turn it on again.
Do you think this will be different?
For me so far, I've been trying it every day and trying to use it. I was just using it right before this. But I agree with Sawyer that I'll probably end up returning it just because it's, I don't know. It's just a little stupid.
What about the comforts of wearing it? Like when you wear it for hours and hours, do you feel any more comfortable than the previous products?
Less comfortable.
I was wondering if you noticed any type of latency or rendering artifacts like blurring or kind of macro blocking or any type of thing that kind of pulls you out of the experience.
The head tracking is absolutely incredible. I mean, you move your head, you tilt your head, you look around, and it looks just like, it tracks exactly. The app interfaces and everything, they track exactly. If you move your head, there's motion blur. That's one of the worst things about it is everything gets kind of blurry when you move your head. That kind of
Yes.
takes you out of the experience. That's why I think they've really oriented it towards stationary use. They make the windows stay there. You can't really move it around. They really want you to use this in one place. And then you got that big battery hanging out with the wire. It's really geared towards that stationary use case right now because of the technical limitations.
The latency is 12 milliseconds, so you can play ping pong or whatever.
The latency, there's no perceptible delay. You can move your hand, it looks just like you're looking through it. And the other thing is the perspective is exactly spot on. You take those glasses off your head and you are seeing the same exact thing. That they did really well. But one of the really weak points is the pass through. It basically is just like a background instead of one of the, environments. You have this sort of camera image, but it just looks kind of blurry. It looks kind of low resolution. When you're in the dark, it gets sort of grainy. It definitely looks like a camera image. That's the one thing that really sort of breaks the illusion. And there's no sort of like occlusion tracking. If I put a window behind my couch, it just shows up in front of the couch. It has no idea that like the couch is there because they're trying to minimize latency. If I put it in a room and shut the door, it doesn't have like any idea about that. So the pass through is definitely one of the weak points on the device, where if they improve the resolution of the cameras, they reduce the motion blur, and they improved that, then it could actually be wearable for a much longer amount of time, I think.
Another issue with the pass through is that, on your iPhone, the iPhone covers like 93+% of the P3 wide color gamut, whereas in the Vision Pro, the pass through is only 55%. So the outside world looks very muted from a color standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like horrible. You kind of get used to it, but it really breaks the illusion. So that could be an easy thing for a Gen 2 that if they improved, I think would just dramatically improve the experience.
I looked up the refresh rate. It says it's 100. I would think that in order for it to not have, very detectable motion blur, it would need to be somewhere in the 240 range.
In terms of like the front-facing display, I think that's totally unnecessary. I think it adds cost, weight, complexity. I think if you get rid of that, and Alex Torville and I were talking about, you could even maybe get rid of the glass on the front of that thing and just do some sort of, plastic, and then just cover the camera lenses with some like sapphire like they do in the iPhones. This would just bring down the weight and cost quite tremendously, I would think, because you don't need that. The eyes look terrible on the front-facing display. And it's a pretty useless feature in my opinion. I don't need to know that someone is, dialed into a movie or something. Like they have the thing on. I know they're in it. Like I don't need to see their eyes. So I get what they were trying to do, but I think that's one way to really bring down the cost in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. Philosophically, it's interesting because you have a camera pass through out of the device, and they have a camera pass through into the device. So it's kind of simulating the product that they want to build, but it's really kind of overusing technology at a great cost to compensate for having to use this camera display. I think where this could really get interesting is if you could have some sort of like transparent OLED display where you could just sort of overlay the app interface and allow optical light to just pass through naturally. Then you could maybe really have something that is pretty compelling and makes you a lot less sort of sick wearing it for long periods.
On the pass-through thing, I think that was one of the reasons why the Google Glass failed, because people discovered indoors it works great because you have a lot of artificial light. But when you go outdoors or you're looking at anything that has the sun's light reflected off of it, the photon count is just so high, it washes anything else out. And you'd have to use a tremendous amount of power to get to compete with natural light. I think they tried using sunglasses and various other approaches, but I think even with that, you're now just muting the rest of it. So it doesn't quite work. Whereas the pass through kind of works a little bit better there. And of course, the R1 chip is just, they're doing a phenomenal job there. And the other thing to remember is like, even though this is the first version of the hardware, it's also the first version of the software. So when I was looking at some of the videos, I thought when you're in a room, right, and you have the headset on and you're working on like, say a vehicle model, and someone else is in the same room and they're working on the vehicle model. Right now you get two different instances. In the future, they could very easily make it so that you're working on the same instance. So you can imagine like, okay, molding, various other things, like how expensive is it to like, build out the first prototypes of things. There could be a lot of applications, but I agree that it's probably going to be very niche in the beginning.
You were to have the ability to connect like headsets together, like let's say you have a long distance relationship and you want to watch the same movie, that you could do that. Or if you want to bring all your friends over, you could all play the same first person shooter game, but with all just different headsets, but they'd all be linked together and have basically virtually no latency. I think that's one way to make it more interactive and less, isolated.
I think going over the internet will be your hardest part there,
Yeah.
but in person in the same place on 1080 108N, it's probably doable now with Wi-Fi these days. So I think it's possible, and the way the headset's built, I wouldn't be surprised if that comes. I just think, if I'm very honest about it, I think they did a really, really good job on the software and the hardware. The expectations are really high for Apple to start with, and I think they at least met those expectations, in my opinion.
This is a
Yeah,
really good product for a first gen.
Sawyer makes a great point. One of the nicest things about it is watching movies or 3D movies. I kind of never pay attention to movies anymore because I'm always looking at X on my phone. So I found it was like this kind of immersive experience where you can really focus on the movie and you can watch the movies in 3D. It looks really amazing in 3D. They have a great selection of 3D movies. Apple made this immersive content. But to Sawyer's point, you've got this great 3D movie viewing experience, amazing on a plane or something like that, but you have to watch it alone. Where's the fun in that? One thing that I really liked is just leaving open multiple apps and windows just all around you and leaving an app in a room. Like, for example, I could take my Dyson app and put it over my Dyson fan. So every time I see the fan, I'm near it, I can then just click on it and control it. And I had I'm working on something, I have my MacBook display open, I'm editing, but I can also throw open the Tesla app on the side, and it's not taking up any room on my display, but I can just sort of glance over to the side and I can see that Tesla app. So I'm like, wow, this is a really interesting experience now where I could actually just sort of leave applications where I want them, leave the timer by the kitchen, actually just move around physically rather than having to switch apps on my phone. There's kind of this illusion that they're in physical space.
The
Yes,
fixed window tracking is incredible in that, like, you have a window open, that thing does not budge. It's not jiggling around. You can walk around that thing, and it's almost as if it's actually in there in real life.
I think the demo from MKBHD in the subway, I've seen it work for some people in the subway. I've not tried it in a subway, but it shows you how it is actually geo-locked as well. So that's really impressive because you can't do that with GPS alone. You can't even do it with GPS plus Wi-Fi alone. So they must be using, you know, visual cues plus those signals so that they're doing multiple
I mean, the
sensor fusion.
accelerometers and the gyroscope probably too.
Correct. Oh, yeah, yeah. Sorry. But you get the point, right? They're doing sensor fusion. So what's interesting about this to me is it kind of is showing like, just like Waymo had to do sensor fusion, Apple's shown a really good skill here in sensor fusion. They've shown really good skill on the chipset side. So, you know, they've kind of jumped ahead in, if like they were to say we're releasing a car before the Vision Pro and after the Vision Pro, I believe that it's possible they could get self-driving faster, not saying before others, but just faster than before they release this. So that's one thing. And then the second thing to me is the spatial computing is actually really complex because when you leave the room and you put different windows all over the place, it has to basically figure out when to offload apps to make it feel as if you have infinite memory, but you don't actually have infinite memory. So that's a really cool piece of the spatial computing software. And so that operating system that they're building, as the hardware improves, as everything changes, that operating system itself is actually pretty complicated to build. So the big kudos to them to getting that right.
Did you get one?
Not get one, but I have tried one.
Why aren't you getting one?
I have considered it. I only could justify it if I was actually going to make apps for it, and I can't really justify the time right now. I'm
I
I'm
think I'm
I'm
gonna
not.
return it and then end up buying another one probably later.
I was going to say I'm not ruling it out yet. I might try to buy them from folks who didn't return it in the return window and they're selling it used. That might be where I can justify the cost.
Yeah, I went to the Apple store last night, and very rarely do you have a first gen product from Apple where you can just show up to the store that day without any reservations and just buy it. And you could last night.
I said, "Hey, you have any? Can I buy one?" They said, "Sure." I'm like, "All right, well, that's too tempting. I got to try it."
Yeah,
Meta, how far do you see the price declining?
hard to gauge, but my guess when I was looking at the teardown video from Jerry Rig Everything, it looks like it's actually pretty complicated to manufacture. A lot of R&D, they have all that. But I also personally think one of the reasons why the price is probably really high is precisely to make people use it. I think if you keep it past the 10-day window, you're going to have a psychological desire to keep using it, to keep checking on it, and developers will make apps for them and you'll start using them. So I think at least all the Quest developers will easily move over. I can't see why you wouldn't port all your stuff over to Apple. It's a pretty big brand. It's going to stick around for a while, most likely. So, um, in terms of like how much the cost comes down, probably a lot. How much the price comes down, probably not that much. Maybe they come down to 3,000. Like, remember when they raised the prices for phones from $600-700 to 1,000 to 1,200 bucks? Everybody thought this is way too expensive, but Apple does this, and Apple makes the market price, and then the market eventually complies. And I think 3,000 is not crazy if it replaces your desktop computer, your TV, and all those devices. I think it's okay. It's a reasonable price.
There was a report a couple months ago that long term, Apple wants to make a cheaper version of this and have the price be around $1,500. It's sort of unknown what kind of compromises they would have to make to get to that price, but I imagine quite a few.
Or the volume would have to be insane.
I mean, don't you guys think that Apple Vision Pro implies that there's going to be Apple Vision, just like iPhone Pro, iPhone?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if they reduce the cost of the display, it would take away from the experience dramatically, and that would probably be the biggest monetary driver, is my understanding.
How many people have bought Quest 2?
Quest 2 is not a direct competitor. Even though it's in a similar-ish space, I think Apple's really coming at it from a perspective of work. And what I really like about the strategy is it looks like they're going after, back in the day, Apple versus Windows, the big differentiator used to be if you're an artist, a musician, a designer, you use the Apple product. And I can totally see how not Quest, Apple Vision Pro could be for people who are graphic designers, 3D designers, musicians, various other things to actually do something because those are the IDEs that tend to be super complex. There's a lot of buttons everywhere. Imagine if you could actually just have like a studio where you're making the sound in a 3D space as opposed to trying to fit everything into your tiny, software screen.
Meta has geared their devices more towards gamers and, metaverse type experiences, whereas Apple's more towards, I think, entertainment and productivity style things. They might get into gaming more, but certainly in their marketing materials and during the presentation, they didn't really talk all that much about gaming.
Yeah, to go into gaming would mean they would have to probably change the screen, in my opinion, because I don't know if you guys experienced it, but there's a lot of motion blur. Did either of you have experience watching fast moving things on the screen?
Yeah, it was perfectly fine, honestly.
Yeah, everything looks really sharp. Every app, everything, it looks, you know, incredibly sharp. There's no problems with, fast moving things or anything like that. But yeah, it's really interesting to contrast the Oculus and the Apple device. They're very different devices. And the Apple device definitely feels more, it's very different. It's more geared towards computing, whereas Oculus is more geared towards gaming. Oculus has two controllers. Apple, you use your hands. The Apple device is definitely more seamless, right? So I put on the Oculus and I get in and it goes. So first of all, like the last time I tried to turn it on, one of my controllers wasn't connecting. So I was like, huh? Only one of my hands is popping up. So I just took it off. I was like, whatever. I can't even figure out how to open any of these apps. But then, it goes, okay, create your boundary. So then you got to like create this boundary so that you don't walk into a wall while you're playing a game. And then it's always asking you to adjust the boundary. You go into a different room. Now you got to draw a new boundary. It's like, this is fucking stupid, right? And then you're playing the game and you constantly see that boundary thing popping up like, hey, you're going to walk into a wall. The way Apple's done it is much more seamless, right? They just kind of fade in everything. There's no setting up a boundary. There's no setting up a controller. You just put it on and use it.
Yeah, the other thing I would just say from like a computational perspective, I think an interesting trade-off here is if you don't go after gaming intentionally and you go after things like Candy Crush or like mobile gaming style gaming, then you don't have to have as much compute power. And from the presentation I'm trying to recall, I don't think there was that much dedicated compute to like graphic rendering. A lot of it's pass through, right? So the pass through stuff is very different from, creating the visuals and then overlaying those visuals. Obviously, they're doing that for the immersive video, but that's pre-computed versus dynamically being computed. So I think that might be one of the ways that they actually are making a trade-off.
I mean, it's got an M2 in there. It's a pretty powerful chip. I took everything off. I took the light seal off. I took the headband off, and I looked at it, and you can really see how close they are to a pair of glasses. It's really not that far away.
Do you know if the M2 does vector processing?
I
Oh,
think so. Yeah,
yeah, you're right. It has matrix multiplication. Yeah, yeah, they call it matrix multipliers. Yeah,
it
never
has
mind.
a
I take
neural
it back.
engine in there. You
Yeah,
can
yeah,
hardware accelerate inference on that chip.
you're correct.
I find it hard to believe that they've targeted productivity, but maybe I find that just to be strange. I also find it strange that they might be trying to replace your desktop. That also seems strange. It seems to me like if I was developing a roadmap for this, in 5 years, I would be targeting something that can replace your sunglasses, or just glasses in general, so that you can always have, kind of second vision. But this first product, honestly, like it's just not interesting to me. And much of the same lines that Omar pointed out, it just I don't know what I'd do with it. I think it's interesting to have like this big 3D display, but strapped to my face is not something that I would enjoy.
I got one on the release day, and one thing I've been fascinated by is how good the movie watching experience is. I found myself sitting on the couch and watching a movie, both 3D and 2D, on my wall, taking up the entire wall, overlaying my $4,000 OLED panel, and then when I go back to the OLED TV, it's like, why would I ever watch a movie on this $4,000 TV when I can watch it 100 inches and it looks just as good or way better, especially in 3D. And so for me, like I know the price is hard to swallow, but for me, like that's worth it alone. And I think as far as the productivity stuff, I think there's a lot of room for that to improve. But yesterday I spent half my day working, forcing myself to work with that. And there was a lot of things, like Omar said, you can have all your apps just laid out and turn around, and it's like having like almost unlimited display space. And the way that you open up your MacBook and it just pops up a little bubble above the display and you just tap it and all of a sudden you got a 4K display that you can resize at any, there's a lot of value there, I think. As far as comfort, the the cool fancy single band that comes with it is definitely not comfortable after, like, for me, like after an hour it like started hurting my forehead. So I switched to the dual band, the dual strap one, and it's way more comfortable. It doesn't look as cool, it messes up your hair, but it's definitely way more comfortable. And I found I could go 2 hours with that with no comfort issues. So um yeah, and as far as the pass through, the lighting has a big effect on it. If the lighting in your room is even just moderate, you it breaks the illusion because everything looks crystal clear that's being generated, but the pass through looks kind of like you're looking through a camera. But if the lighting's really good in the room, it actually fools the brain and you really think you're just looking through glass. But the lighting has to be like perfect, like really bright for that effect. So I think once they improve the cameras and they're able to do the low light much better, they're going to be able to fix those issues where like Omar said, it's breaking the illusion.
Yeah,
You know,
that's been a
yeah,
big issue for me too, is the low light. I find myself
right.
having to like turn on lights, especially at night, that I normally wouldn't turn on. I'm like turning on extra lamps. I'm getting like table lamps because like the hand detection detects it and fails to detect it because of the low light. So it's definitely a little distracting. You've got this great 100-inch movie, like you said. It's a great experience, but then out of the corner of your eye, you see your hand flickering in and out of existence. It's a little bit confusing and maybe concerning. So then you kind of have to put it under a blanket or something so that that doesn't happen.
Omar, Alex asked earlier if you bought the Climax cloth.
Climax cloth? What is that?
Sawyer knows what it is. Sawyer?
Yeah, it's $100 Climax cloth. You don't know about that, bro?
It came with a cloth in the box. Are we still talking about the Vision Pro?
I think so. Meta, did you have one?
It wasn't mine, and I didn't ask them if they bought a Climax cloth. I didn't know such a thing existed.
Well, it's by far the top trending search result for Apple Vision Pro right now. So if anyone knows what it is, please come up, because I don't either.
So, if you want to watch Finding Nemo in 3D for just $3,500, you can do it.
3,510 probably, right? You gotta pay for the movie.
Honestly, like if you're into tech and you have 3,500 or even you can like return it, it's worth checking out because it's just fucking cool. If you're like into gadgets and shit, like this is a peek at the future. Is it a little half baked? Yes, but there really is something in this direction.
Yeah, for a while back when the Quest first came out, actually, no, I think it was Oculus. There was these mixed reality experiences that started popping up, and I thought those were pretty cool. It's like kind of like a museum. You walk through it, and they had things placed in different locations, or three-dimensional art you would walk through, and that never really took off because I think the creation of it was really hard, or whatever the case was. But what I find interesting with the Apple Vision Pro is because they're partnering with Disney right off the bat, Disney having giant theme parks, you can imagine, at least for some companies, a lot of use cases where they could use this to really reduce their manufacturing cost to just see how things are going to lay out, how things are going to get built out. So I know Wes is saying he doesn't necessarily see this as a productivity tool, but I could see like AutoCAD, music. I think there's a lot of spaces where this could take off.
Is there like a common agreement among people that there is one killer app at least? Maybe it's the movie viewing experience.
The killer app is the Apple ecosystem. I can load my messages, my mail, my photos, my Safari, my music. I can go on the App Store. With minimal effort, developers can sort of port it compared to learning a brand new platform like the MetaQuest. It's kind of like a new compilation target. You can reuse a lot of the same code that you have for iOS. I can run X out of the box without them doing anything. So I'm actually wearing it right now. I've got X open and I can scroll it just by moving my fingers. I can push another button, I can open the Tesla app. And there's some cool apps in there. There's like a DJ app where you can actually like get a physical turntable and it kind of simulates that. You can there's one app where it shows like your local airport and they show all the planes like landing and taking off in real time. So I think the best killer apps have really yet to be created. But the reason why it's so much more interesting to me and I think has been so much more enduring than the Oculus is like the Oculus I put on and I was like, I really want to use this. It's cool, but I truly cannot figure out what to do. I don't care that much about games. I just don't know what to do with this thing. But with the Apple, I'm actually finding that I can do things in there because of the Apple ecosystem.
Did you get a headache when you used the Quest?
Not really, but maybe over like really long periods.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. There's some folks who have like motion sensitivity, and I haven't really heard if those people have tried it and seen a difference.
I looked up Climax cloth. I had to do some digging around, but apparently it's for polishing your hardware. If you want to polish your hardware, you could get the Climax cloth. $19.
I would say the other killer app, Wes, is if you take a video with your phone and then you watch it in there yourself, uh, that's pretty impressive. So I can imagine the killer app being your kid's walking video recorded in a three-dimensional space that you can go watch later on. Eventually, you can imagine like they could use AI to use a voxel space and you could like walk around in places that the video didn't even record. So I think these killer apps are going to get bigger.
That's the thing is like with generative AI, There's some really exciting possibilities here, right? You could say, okay, redecorate my room and have stable diffusion, re-render your room in real time. You could, so I had an app idea yesterday. We were talking it over. Give sight to the blind. So you simply take the cameras on the device, which move along with your head, and you combine it with like the GPT-4 Vision API, or even theoretically like some vision model that could be inferenced on the device in the future. But you combine it with like the ChatGPT Vision API, and you simply allow a blind person to ask questions about what they're seeing in front of them. I mean, that could be a fucking killer app for someone who doesn't know how to see. And they can just put this thing on their face and, maybe a little bit bulky, but they could say, "Hey, what's going on in front of me?" They could ask any question and it could probably answer it pretty well. So I think there's some really interesting possibilities with AI that they haven't even really started to scratch the surface of.
I think one of the hardest parts is the nose piece. If they start making custom pieces or third parties start making custom pieces that fit your face a little bit better, it could get a lot more comfortable.
In the replies, Griffin says the killer app for me is recording my 2-year-old son in 3D and reliving those moments in immersion mode. It's so realistic, unbelievable, and you can record spatial videos on an iPhone Pro 15, so you don't need to wear the headset to record.
Wouldn't this be enhanced with some kind of haptics?
My understanding is you could easily pair something with these devices, and there'll be third-party things where you could maybe wear gloves. If we look at this Apple launch and say this is complete and this is all it's going to be, we're making a big mistake. It reminds me of when the Nintendo Switch came out. There's a few sensors in there that they didn't even tell people were there, and then they launched like the Nintendo Cardboard Surface, and then people realized there was a whole bunch of sensors in the devices that they didn't call out at first. So I think there's going to be creative uses, and Apple has shown that they stick to a product, even like the watch and various other things that maybe didn't do so well in the first generation. So I think the hardest hurdle is getting developers to commit. And because there have been gold rushes in the past, I can see developers actually committing and making the ecosystem better.
This really is the future. I got my X app open here and I'm moving around it just by moving my hands. I don't have any device in my hands. My hands are free to do whatever I want. And I can just manipulate these apps just by not using a mouse or using a touch screen, but by these cameras actually looking at my hand and interpreting my gestures, looking at my eyes. Like that's the other thing we didn't talk about is the eye tracking. How you just click on something just by basically looking at it. Your eyes are the mouse essentially. So I mean it's silly, it's useless, but at the same time, this is what the future of computing is going to look like, I think. When the whole world is your canvas and you can just sort of use natural gestures and speech to interact with your apps rather than, physical touch or a mouse. I think that is probably the direction we're going to go just because of the potential of sort of making the whole world your canvas.